institutions are US-based. Oops.
Sorry.
That's okay, no problem. So really, that is the story. The myth is really just that. There are a number of schools over the course of the last few years, especially across the country and around the world, that are moving in this direction, and colleges are beginning to recognize that. So as we go to the next myth, the next myth is that most institutions don't utilize necessarily a holistic review process. So you would think that a mastery transcript, which actually includes skills, the skills that students learn, not necessarily the courses they've taken, we do list those, but the skills, the competencies that really will prepare students for college, career, for life, really, and to be a contributing citizen in this global world. I think we have to consider that most institutions do actually use a holistic review process. The majority of institutions out there, yes, there might be a bar set in terms of a GPA and a test score, but there's more information that tells the story about a student's experience. And I think if you do one more click, George, you'll get to that part where they might not use it at the outset, but most schools do implement some form of holistic review process once initial thresholds are met. If not met, they might look deeper, because the majority of institutions are really out there looking for the best opportunities to provide to learners who are really seeking to move forward in their lives and contribute globally. But they're also looking to diversify their incoming class. They want to make sure that the classes that they're bringing in are harmonious, that have opportunities to learn from one another about the different experiences that they have. And they're able to actually discern their readiness for the rigors of the academics they'll experience from the evidence that's provided on a mastery transcript or an MTC learning record or a competency-based learning record, whichever record a school chooses to use. The competencies that are provided and then the evidence that students are sharing really do paint the picture of what's the learning story of that individual student. And we've gleaned a great deal of information from folks at institutions who've accepted our students. And you'll see the second link that was dropped there is actually a video of a higher education talkback roundtable that we did virtually with a number of admissions professionals who share their feedback about using that kind of data in a holistic review process. I forgot to mention the first link that was dropped by Christoph is actually a list of all of the 315 colleges that have accepted students with a mastery transcript. We can forward to the next slide, George. And, this is always a consideration, right? It takes more time to look at competencies. It takes more time to review student evidence. It takes more time to look at a real story that gives and illuminates a picture of a student that's far more than just a list of courses and GPA. Yes, it does. There's no question. While that is a reality, it does take more time. And there is a limited time to read. But there's also an opportunity for really to learn more about the student and get more authentic information so that you make the right decision about the selection at the university level, and quite frankly, so that the student makes the right decision. Competency-based records do provide a more complete picture of every learner, and the evidence included is both educator and school verified. That's what I think a lot of people don't recognize, that an educator has to approve a piece of evidence that a student uploads to their mastery transcript, and the administration at the school also has to provide that verification. So there are a number of pieces that allow for credibility and validation of the work that's included. But I think it's also important to point out that most universities engage two readers to reduce the potential for bias. So there is a time element here that is significant because you're wanting to make the right choice. But I want to also emphasize that in our experience, no university or college has rejected to even read an application with a mastery transcript attached. We know that oftentimes colleges receive applications from all over the world with a variety of instructional programs, a variety of courses, the way they're represented. So we certainly want to make sure that people know that college admissions offices can adapt, certainly. And they have over the last 4 years for sure. The link in the chat is to a CAPS network. If you're familiar with the CAPS network, it's a career-based program that's taken hold here in a number of school districts across the country, where it's very much skills-based and based on a durable skills framework, where students are actually building real skills. And that's an individual student story about someone who was not admitted on specifically GPA and SAT scores alone to begin with, but then went back to that institution and talked about the skills she had learned through her CAPS experience. And that was what turned around the admissions decision for her at a large university here in the United States. So highly recommend you give that a listen. And the next slide. What about scholarships and college athletics? This is one of the big questions that we have, for sure. Learners can't qualify for merit-based scholarships or collegiate athletics without a GPA and test scores. And that's absolutely not always true, right? We understand, especially in the US and definitely abroad, there are requirements around certain thresholds that students have to meet in order to earn a merit-based scholarship. And our goal at MTC, and with any institution, any organization that's providing competency-based records, is to ensure that no student has any sort of harm done against them. We want them to have all of the opportunities they can to have their college experience funded with merit-based scholarships. Independent institutions have much more flexibility to determine merit-based scholarship criteria, of course, but there are changes that are on the horizon in the United States. And one such example is a House bill in South Carolina that promotes a whole district route to competency-based education implementation. And one part of that bill specifically states the Commission on Higher Education and State Board for Technical and Comprehensive Education shall establish policies to provide fair and equitable access to institutions of higher education and technical colleges, as well as scholarships and financial aid for graduates of schools implementing innovative school models and using non-traditional diplomas and transcripts. It's also important to note that in many state policies, there are references to other merit options that the states have flexibility to utilize. So I think that's a really important point as well. I also want to highlight college athletics in the United States. The NCAA for years and decades has used the rule of a minimum grade point average and a minimum SAT score in order to be eligible for that first year in college athletics. I don't know if you're aware, but across the country, it was a big deal when back in January, the NCAA voted to eliminate the SAT and ACT minimum scores being utilized to determine academic or athletic eligibility that first year. So that has been minimized. In the chat, there is a webinar, a recording of a webinar that was conducted by Aurora Institute, where NCAA talked about those policy updates, and also shared an example of them working with one of our member schools at MTC in particular, who are shifting away from traditional grades and towards a mastery-based program, and how NCAA is working within those new paradigms to really shift how they look at their non-traditional approach to certifying schools and then certifying college athletes. So there's a lot of change on the horizon. And so I think it's really important to identify that these two, which are really central to many American learners, in particular, the opportunities for merit scholarships and collegiate athletics, everything is starting to change. Where there's a will, there's a way. And that's what we're seeing happening through these proof points that we're experiencing from all of the different schools who've been actually sending out mastery transcripts and MTC learning records. And I note there, some schools have not been using the mastery transcript, but are taking part in our new pilot with a learning record. And that learning record is really an opportunity to use your traditional transcript, but also at the same time, elevate your competency-based framework. So really, while there's still more work to do across the country and around the world, as states and schools across the US and globally make shifts to more personalized competency-based approaches to learning, we have some evidence here that there are movements being made, and we're certainly very excited about the opportunities ahead for learners and graduates and schools to shift and feel confident that there are opportunities to have your students shine in that all-important application process.
Well, Susie, thank you very much. Yeah, it's really impressive the curve that MTC has been going through in terms of adoption, and it gives me so much hope, I guess, because George and I are really driven by this desire of wanting to nudge the dial a little bit more towards a progressive type of education, because this is really where, and George, if you allow me to speak in your name also, really something which is what we need nowadays. What I did find ironic or surprising actually is I was in a round table last week, and they were talking about applicant tracking systems coming out of HR, which is basically artificial intelligence based tracking systems, filtering systems from a hiring perspective. And obviously AI, and I'll make a quick parenthesis, this is going to be the topic of our next roundtable with George, and we'll give you the dates and the times at the end of this presentation here. But it's funny how in a time of like AI and technological power, like unprecedented levels, we seem to go away from that mechanical filtering process, which would be SAT, GPA based, to a more holistic human based process. So I just found that reflection, and the same thing is true in HR, by the way. So these ATCs are super prevalent. A lot of companies are using it, but ultimately the pendulum seems to be swinging a little bit into the other direction. And this is true in education also from what you're saying. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So George, do you want to introduce Jonathan and maybe let him get started, or do you have any questions?
No, I'd be happy to, Christoph. John BURDICK, as you heard in the introduction at the beginning of the roundtable, is Vice Provost for Enrollment at Cornell University. Very heavily focused on providing access. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, George and Christoph, and it's terrific to have a chance to hear Susie. I just want to make sure you're hearing me. I'm not seeing myself on the screen. Okay. I'm going to pick up, I think, on the broader set of questions that was part of Susie's presentation about how secondary schools are preparing and guiding students through their feedback into the transition to university ahead. And I'm going to follow the same format in terms of myths and realities. And then I'm going to sort of come at it from the other side. I'm speaking from 38 years of experience at 3 selective universities in the United States, and always in the admissions and financial aid space, to talk about sort of the same concepts in reverse and how we look at that. And in doing that, I hope to suggest that there are some serious myths and problems, and better answers. Some of this, I think I've seen some of you in your experience, this is going to be familiar ground that you are also already trying to tell your families and students. But there's some subtleties to it. It's not a black and white question. And I think it's valuable that organizations like this roundtable and others are looking for reforms and new growth across this industry, because I think the mission of access and opportunity that we share is in a time of enormous transition. And I myself am in a time of transition. I'm stepping away from duties at Cornell at the end of this month, and thinking that the action in our industry is swinging more and more to the secondary side and what we do there to help prepare the broadest set of our students for all the experiences that they might have and all the ways that they might show it. So we can go to the first slide. Looking ahead from the secondary school, and this is mostly the perspective of students and their advocates, whether those are parents or counselors. And again, I think some of this is going to feel like familiar ground, but I want to reaffirm that this is how universities already think, because I hope it might suggest that the platform for reform is not quite as challenging as all that. I think there's room and space in the review side of universities to consider things like mastery transcript and other evidence of learning from other kinds of sources. That the time is now. First, there's that basic question: is there one best place for me? That idea that there is a dream school that is worth pursuing. And the myth is that that's yes, and it sort of gets bound with the concept of fit. But the truth is, we're not in a fit process, and the things implied by the word fit are increasingly troublesome and problematic to me. Most people are going to match in an important way with a lot of places that are going to have the academic environment they want, the social and developmental environment that they want and need, and are not even necessarily for sure a major research university or for sure a residential liberal arts college or anything in between. Might involve a whole host of different kinds of experiences. And I think it's important to keep that opened up, because it often becomes the case, as we see in the numbers of students applying early, and especially early decision, to a lot of places like Cornell and others. There's that belief that there's this one dream, and that's almost certainly not true. And some of the structures we built to reinforce that are, I think, subject to some review. Number two, is there a guarantee? And in selective admission, there is a perception, probably reinforced this morning by the two appeals courts that have reversed two of the decisions in the Varsity Blues case, saying that there is in fact no scandalous way to seek admission. So legacy, talent, identity, even just raw money in donor form. The myth is that that's something that can guarantee you space and access. And the truth is it doesn't. When a place is operating an ethical, professional operation, even a massive donation is no guarantee by itself. And the point is that there's no one single factor that ever drives the decision in review. And then the sort of question beyond that question is well, how am I maximizing my chances? Will I get in? And there's whole industries that are designed to measure and evaluate how that might be predictably true based on grades or test scores, very occasionally and almost too rarely on the other factors that matter so much. And the big myth that I've seen grow over the last 20 years that I think it's important, I don't see this often enough in our industry dialogue. There's a lot of news in major publications about how it's mathematically harder than ever to get into schools. There's published both at the end of the year and in intermediate zones, the admission rates, the application rates, and it sort of fuels this fire and rage that it's nearly impossible. And I think that drives a lot of troublesome behavior, both from students and from others. And the truth is, mathematically, that's not at all what's happening. What's clearly happening instead is that students are applying to more and more places. I think that the numbers just in the Common App process in the United States alone show a growth of more than one year by year in the average number of applications that students are putting out there. Common App shifted from 15 maximum to 20 maximum just recently. And as more and more apps fly, you do get increasing numbers of applications and technically lower admission rates. But the truth is, it hasn't gotten any harder for those people who are prepared and on their way to get into the great schools, whether that's in the United States or elsewhere. It just is a matter of maybe not any one school is predictable, but the idea that when you file all those applications that you're going to have access to something truly great and that you truly want is actually probably better. And the demographic curves worldwide, but especially in the US right now, suggest that's going to be more and more true. In fact, I would suggest that we are in a transition from what has been a seller's market from universities in the United States to one that is a buyer's market, where universities are increasingly competing to attract their enrollment. And that's going to even be true for those that are most elite, despite some scholars notes to the contrary. I think even the elite colleges and universities are facing challenges in assembling the class and the people that they want. Sort of a core question is, can you possibly do enough academically, whether that's through an accelerated or enhanced or honors curriculum, whether that's about achieving the grade point average that you need and doing that through the grade inflation environment that Christoph mentioned in the chat. And I think the idea that drives so much troublesome behavior on the part of students is that they not only need straight A's, they need to prepare over and over and over again for perfect scores on a variety of exams. Of course, in the United States, the focus is on ACT, SAT, but everywhere in the world there are exams, and there's a whole lot of winnowing of really valuable activity on the part of students, whether it's collaborative activity, team building, creative activity, social activity, and sort of channeling all of that into the effort to maintain straight A's and earn the perfect scores. And the truth is, and this is, I'm speaking here from my nearly 40 years of experience, perfect straight A's have never been an important dimension in this process. While they're admired, along with high scores or even perfect scores, can be admired elements in a student's application. Really, in the holistic process that I've always been part of, it matters to be good. It matters to be evidently well prepared and to be embracing a challenge and growing through your experience during secondary school. But perfect doesn't matter at all. If I can quote statistics from my most current experience, an overall admit rate of 7 or 8% translates into an admit rate for those students with perfect straight A's and perfect test scores of maybe 11%. It is not an overwhelmingly numbers-driven process to the point where everything that a student can possibly do or everything that a school can possibly foster should be aimed at getting students to that level of perfection. And not only that, I think as we take a long view and look at the culture, and COVID, I think, helped us all think about this more clearly, it's not really responsible in conveying information to our students, to teenagers, that perfection is what they are after. No matter how important it is to them and to their family to try and access the best possible universities, perfection hurts. It is not a good guide to life in almost any circumstance that we can think of. And it's not a good guide to activity in this process. And then, have I done enough in other ways? Because I think students, especially applying to selective universities, are aware that there should be things that they can do other than just earn good grades and scores. They're not purely seeking an academic experience, but a life experience. And I think the inevitable conclusion that a lot of students arrive at is that the busier and broader and longer their resume and the deeper their evidence of years of experience, the more they want to show a long list. Truth is, when you're sitting in committee and you're doing review, there's only about 3 things at most you can say about a particular student that they're likely to remember. So that's, again, not a need to develop a very long resume as a high school student. We can go to the next slide and sort of look at how this all is perceived from the college side. Colleges, they have their own mythos about what they're doing, and they'll repeat it ad nauseum, which is that we're assembling the best class. And we're doing it through very careful reading and sifting, and it will be great, and it is in some ways perfect, and it comes at the end of a very complicated process. And in a sense, all of that is true, but I will guarantee that in my nearly 40 years of doing this, I have made thousands of mistakes, taking students that really weren't the best match for the place I was seeking, and not taking students who would have been absolutely terrific there in every way. And that's not just because of being highly selective. It's simply just misunderstanding and misreading and not getting enough. Our information is incomplete. And when you think about how abstract it is, it can be horrifying. The grade in a class is an abstraction of the work. The grades on a transcript assembled to a GPA are an abstraction of multiple grades and experiences. And God forbid you have class rank, because that's an abstraction of the actual GPA itself. It should be a humbling experience as we do our review. The other thing that is said, although I think the brightest minds have recognized that they should stop saying this, and it is less common, is that the process is fair. And that's in part referring to the high standards, and Susie mentioned this, the high standards for grades and test scores, and that then we turn to our deeper processes to find choices among the many students who meet those standards. But that's not all that's going on. And in the previous slide, I said that legacy, talent, identity don't guarantee, but they do offer paths. And so there are elements of this that I think people would struggle to define as absolutely and completely fair. All the time that I've been doing this work, and it's one of the things that's sort of driving me to reconsider where this work is taking us, where we should go, is this idea that we're marketing. We're marketing to the broadest possible market, the same way a soap bottle would, to get as many take as we can, as many eyes on our product, and a representation that we offer a great education comprehensively in all subjects and all experiences. That's never been true. Universities and colleges have very great distinctions in their environment and very great distinctions in their academic portfolio. And inevitably, if you are marketing hard to an audience of students who are not have a lot of context to make these choices, they're going to apply for the wrong reasons. And one of the biggest wrong reasons that bothers me the most is applying to a place because it's highly selective. Nothing wrong with being ambitious, everything wrong with thinking that you need to prove something in this process by applying to a place just because it's hard to get into. A question that colleges will say is that we're collecting comprehensive info. There's a lot of defense of the status quo, including things that might represent resistance to things like the mastery transcript, and that informs our review, and it's been good enough for 60 years or 100 years, and that if we filter it through, that's a good way to do that. But I think that misrepresents the process somewhat, and I'm back to the question of humility. There's some luck. The first reader's review will become a part of the second reader's review and impression, and it can cascade toward failure or toward success for reasons that were beyond the student's control and not even within the process that the college and university deliberately designed. And finally, this is a big one. There's a constant battle back and forth with people accusing universities of not being transparent, and universities saying we're being as transparent as we possibly can. And mostly pointing to their web pages, which are truly full of thousands of words, jam-packed information and advice and guidance in every way. But the truth is, there's always holes in a web process or a chat bot or any other kind of way we try to represent carefully our process. And if we are not being open to an iterative process of dialogue with students and counselors, even after the web page has been read and the procedures have been followed, we are not, in fact, dealing with the real questions that students and counselors legitimately have. So those are my hot takes on where we're going with this industry and some practical things to think about as we try to better inform and guide our students and get them to the right arenas. And I will turn it over.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
That was refreshingly honest. I really appreciate that. I'm just wondering, I want to go back to something that Christoph said after Susie's presentation about AI and the role of ChatGPT or other types of AI. Looking in your crystal ball, where do you see that going in the college admissions process?
You know, I read an article just this morning that said, reportedly from a student saying, hey, we're already using ChatGPT a lot more than you think, and you're not figuring it out and you're not going to. And I'm sorry for the dog. I tend to agree with that student. I think ChatGPT ultimately settles into a tool the same way that calculators ultimately settled into a tool, even though they were massively resisted at first as being a cheat. And I think that students will find over time the best ways to use them as they become sort of ChatGPT natives coming through 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade right now. They'll use that tool the way it can be used. It will help them get started on their outlining. It'll help sort of get past the pedestrian steps in writing. And then they will become, I think, in most part, better experts in refining that to be truly great writing that's about themselves. I honestly think the admissions essay is the least vulnerable part of this because it is so deeply personal, and ChatGPT's one greatest flaw so far is that it invents detail that isn't really there in the initial questioning and phrasing. And I think students, to the extent that they want to be admitted to universities, will be looking to translate what that tool produces into some real authenticity. And that's really the point of those essays in the first place.
That's great. Thank you. I have some additional questions, but I'll save them for the fireside chat so that we can turn this over to Chrissie.
Yeah, my lips are also burning, John. But I think especially the role of AI and things like that it's just impacting everything and everywhere. But I really liked how how both you and Susie have taken us through a progression of reality check. It's not important to be good at the business of being a student. This is an expression I borrowed from a friend of mine who's also on this call, which is called Paul Magnuson. It's actually important to be authentic, to be real, and then to be able to show that the best way you can. There is nevertheless another reality to this, because we've heard about a tool of how this could be used, the MTC. You've seen the reality of how a place like Cornell looks at these kind of questions, but then there's the reality of being in a school and trying to enact on the change and doing the necessary change management and education of parents, faculty, and students around these things. And that's why Chrissie is here with us, and she'll share some of her war stories with us.
Thanks, Christoph. Just pointing out that there's actually an N in my name too. So, I've never seen my last name misspelled. My first name is usually, so I applaud you for spelling my first name right. So you can go to the first slide right away. So this, I have to say, I was actually surprised when George stopped me in the hall of ECIS and asked whether I would be part of this panel. And I have to admit that at first I thought, probably because I've been in these fireside chats and I'm someone who doesn't hold back if I have a question or a comment, and then they thought, okay, they'll put me on the panel so I get to see what it's like on the other side. So, and the reason, but really I mean, obviously I'm bringing a school's perspective, but also, I don't think that our school is as far along as other schools. So I'm certainly not an expert, but I can certainly tell you about our school's journey, because we have started, and after hearing me speak, you may have more questions than answers. So we can just go on to the next slide. So I would say that the first time I heard about Mastery Transcript, and it wasn't yet the consortium, it was actually just beginning to talk about whether the consortium is something that could happen, was back in like 2013, 2014. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. For me personally, I was actually moving between two schools, and so there wasn't a whole lot I could do right away. And in fact, it got to be even more complex because the school I went to, within the first 3 weeks, they had a strike. And so teachers weren't looking, or nobody was looking at something like visionary or strategic. We were looking at like, make sure that they get paid well, make sure that they're happy and morale, et cetera. But so we were working on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But then in 2000, after that first year went by, 2015, we started looking at values. Who are we as a school? Who do we want to be? And we came up with the value statement: believe, inspire, succeed. And it's nice because it's also an acronym for Bavarian International School. But this really stuck and has now become the value statement. People believe that this is our mission statement. This is exactly what the school is about. And it is throughout the entire school. So that was a huge first step in looking at how school can be different. And we then, you can go to the next school, we started talking about what are those skills that kids are going to need? What do they need to be successful? And these meta skills, by the way, these are, I mean, you can find them written different ways, but we just had our IBM talk about their leadership program, and they were talking about these meta skills that we had been talking about back in 2015-16 already. But how do we measure these? Obviously, back to Susie and actually John as well, it's not something that you put into a grade. So how do we measure these? So we've been working on how can we show that our kids are moving forward in these areas. Of course, my DP teacher was incredibly excited when I said this would be something that we could look at, until he thought, but how are they ever going to get into college? Some other questions, students, they were very interested because they see how they can show that they're not just limited to one grade, or one transcript, this traditional transcript, and this choice, alternative paths, etc. But even leadership, they were saying, how do we personalize this student experience and still meet all these requirements? And it is so hard to quantitatively measure. It's the conversation I constantly have with my supervisory board when they're talking about KPIs. That may be something that others have had to deal with as well. Faculty, they're saying, so now you get to put this extra thing on me. This is before COVID realized. After COVID, I mean, I haven't even I won't go there. But what goes away? What are you going to take off my plate so that I can now do this in its stead? The board wanted to know, how does this affect our KPIs? How are we going to say that we're one of the leading schools when we're not having, I don't know, some huge DP score? And parents, they thought, oh, it's really touchy-feely. How will my child get into the top universities? But even more important to that, more questions came about, if it works for the top universities, super, but my kid's not one of those who has to go to the, like John said, one of the top elite schools that's so difficult to get in. Will it work for other universities who are perhaps not those heavy hitters and don't have the resources to go through the different types of transcripts? And then students, they were all about agency voice, but they're really concerned about university acceptance when they get older. So a little bit about what we've done. Next slide, please. First, we started, those are the questions I asked. You can go another slide, sorry. Yes, so what we started, first of all, I'll say, my son, my youngest is a grade 10 student this year. When he started at this school, when we moved here with the strike and everything, he was in grade 2. And I said to him, you know, I don't care, he's a learning support kid. I said, I don't care what your grades, they don't matter. If you are learning is what matters. If you are learning, the grades are going to come by themselves. So he was in a PYP program, grade 2, they don't get grades anyways. He just took it, he parroted it back to all of his teachers. They thought that was great in primary. In secondary, he even thought it was still good in 6th grade and 7th grade, when his grades weren't like all 7s. But it was all of a sudden at the end of 8th grade, when his 2 older siblings had gone off to college, he starts saying, you know, it actually does make a difference what my grades are, because I won't get into college. And I said, believe me, if you are learning the material, the grades will come by themselves. And that's not the important stuff. It's all the other stuff that you're doing. So we also really, I love that he's parroted it back. But in the primary school, we've started moving away from traditional kinds of reporting. So we started with Seesaw, where there's a lot of portfolios, et cetera. And the kids are showing their own learning, a lot of student agency and what they choose as their own learning. We've had assessment expos where staff can see what kind of different assessments do we offer kids so that they can show their learning. This goes back to some of the stuff that I think Susie was sharing at the very beginning. There are many, many different ways to show what you've learned. We have this idea, I'm jumping all over the place, but this fail forward, that's throughout the school. When I had my DP coordinator say that to parents, and parents parrot back to me again that said, wow, what's this new thing, fail forward? It's not new, but it was new to the community, and that they've taken it on. I mean, when you hear it parroted back to you, then that's, you know, you're making progress. We've also started reducing the number of formal report cards and what's on those formal report cards in favor of other kinds of reporting. Even in our storytelling, we're making sure that we're telling all those other things. We're not only talking, of course, we do also publish our DP scores every year, like every other school, or almost every other school. But that's just one little piece. So much more is about our Infinity or passion projects, or where those are going. So showing how these kids, all these other amazing things that they're doing, that has really changed the shift and looked at what people are looking at. And then finally, I would say right now what we're looking at is, obviously we have to continue to communicate transparently so that parents know what we're doing, and it's a slow process. If you don't know Germany, Germany is probably one of the most bureaucratic countries in the world, and our international community takes on that bureaucracy and holds on to it. But we do have to make sure that they're understanding the path that we're on. It's a slow path, but it's a steady path forward. So currently what we're doing is we're actually looking at that, the mastery, the MTC learning record as an addendum to our traditional transcript, and want our students to be involved in what actually should be those competencies that we have on that transcript. So it's exciting, and as student agency becomes much, much bigger in our school, I think it's going to just take off a lot quicker than if it's just us adults doing it. So the last slide I have is talking about the questions I currently have. So I thought when you guys started talking about AI, I was like, wait a minute, that's my last slide. So how can and will AI help? Yeah. I mean, can it recognize competency? So not so much, I'm not worried about kids using it, I use it, you know, to get me started on certain topics. But can it be used to recognize those competencies, those other kinds of transcripts? So it's not just, you know, the numbers game. How can the work of these schools and universities, you know, be closer together? I was on the CIS, the Council of International Schools AGM last week, and the chair of that board right now is the director of admissions, I'll say for lack of having his exact title in front of me, of IE University in Madrid. And he was talking about how they're really looking at these kinds of different kind of holistic ways of showing what the kids' competencies are, and having universities and schools working much closer together, then we will actually make progress. But how can we then distribute that wider? So it's not just, you know, elite or top universities, because IE is definitely among those, but you know, how do we get the state universities to start thinking this way, or state schools to start looking at it differently? And how can we try, you know, again, assessment practice, how can they be revolutionized? I don't like to, you know, just evolve. I want to revolutionize everything. And then how can we influence the teacher training programs so that when these new people come in to our schools, that they're excited about this kind of, showing this kind of learning of the competency and those meta skills that we need. So, like I say, I probably have more questions than answers as well, but I hope it's given you a little bit of a picture of what we've been doing here at BIS. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissie. And it's you know, it's super refreshing. And when you and I talked in preparation of this, you said the same thing as you said as a disclaimer. It's like, well, we're not that advanced in it, but you know what? It's about the journey. It's about getting started. It's about doing an inside-out process. But I think the combo of you know what Susie was saying, and especially what John was saying, that inside-out process is also has to be like, you have to bounce some risks along the way. Well, we suddenly heard that there may be fewer risks than they thought there would be, but there's definitely plenty of things that we'll need to kind of take apart in the fireside chat afterwards. So George.
Thanks, Christoph, and thanks to all three of our panelists today, Susie, Chrissie, and John. We really appreciate the time that you took to prepare and share with us today. We'd also like to thank all of our participants who were with us. We know that your time is very valuable, and we really appreciate that you spent some time with us today. So thank you to everyone for being a part of this. Just a reminder that we will transition into a fireside chat in just a minute or two. But before we do, we just want to remind you that our next strategic roundtable is going to be scheduled for September. So we're going to take the summer off. And the topic for our next roundtable will be embracing AI and deep fakes, threat and opportunities. So looking at it not only from the aspect of how deep fakes and AI can make our lives and our work more difficult, but also are there opportunities there that we can take advantage of. So on behalf of myself, Christoph, our panelist, again, we want to thank you for joining us today. We hope that you'll stay for the fireside chat. And we hope to see you again soon. And certainly we hope that you'll not only sign up for our roundtable in September, but maybe spread the word a little bit, and we can try to get even more people to join us. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stop the recording, and we're going to transition into our fireside chat.